losers, on the grander theme of saints and sinners.
Okay, and time?
9 minutes, or less.
So you want 7, 8, and 9, 9:15?
So, Chair, fellow speakers, this isn't really a speech, it's more a cry of anguish for all those honest and decent people called John. Which you realise that there are many in this club, and it's a popular name, but with it goes a sadness, and I'll come to the sadness in a minute. I imagine you all had good fun at the Platinum Jubilee, and street parties and things and everything else, and that's really nice. It's nice to see that despite all the ups and downs and all the rest of it, there's still support for the monarchy in this country, because it makes us different, it makes us special, it makes us interesting. And when you think of it, in the monarchy, over the years, there's a huge tradition. My apologies to Yola, who didn't go to a school in this country, and therefore never got all this, but there you are, kings and queens of England. There they are, right from the start. And, well, I won't go through them all. But the important thing is that there are lots of Egberts and Edmunds, and there are 8 Henrys, and there are, I lost count of the Edwards, and there are even Osberts. But there's only ever one John. 800 years ago, there was a King John, and he got a very bad press. And since that time, there's never been another King John. And in fact, the whole issue is that John is okay as a name for a kid, isn't it? I mean, I can't think of anything else to call your kid. Call him John. It's very obvious, but if you want to reach the aristocracy, if you want to go high in life, if you want to really do so, we need a posh name. We need a posh name. John, let's face it, a posh name, because if you look back on times gone by in England, there was John the baker, John the candlestick maker, John the butcher. Everyone was John the cartwright, It was just one of those things. So we haven't had a King John for 800 years, and that's my cry of anguish. And when you look even at Parliament, there are 644, I think, MPs at the moment, and I looked through them quickly to see if I could see a John or two, but there's no Johns, all sorts of other names, strange names these days, but no Johns, and the names vanished from the aristocracy as well, you see. It just vanished. You've got Charles, obviously, George, got Lucas now, William, Lindsay, Harry, Edward, no Johns. Lindsay, you go on and on, there are no Johns. Vanished from the aristocracy, and you could watch Downton Abbey till your eyeballs turn square. And amongst that lot, you will never find a John. There are simply no Johns amongst the aristocracy. I think that's suppose the gardener's called John, but just the way it goes. So that's the sadness, you see, and that's all because 800 years ago, King John was labelled a tyrant and a sinner. And there he is. King John, that's a pretty authentic photograph from him. That's a portrait of him from the National Gallery. There he is. Looks okay, doesn't he? Well, he looks a bit like me, actually. He's not often represented in that way. This is a very good picture with a saucer from the National Portrait Gallery. There he is, looking grim and serious. And well, it was just his lot in life to be called a bully. And I just want to say, the cry of anguish is, it's just not fair. It's absolutely not fair, because it's not true. Well, all right, he was a tyrant, but nobody's perfect. I just get on with this little story as quickly as I can, but the whole thing starts with a girl called Eleanor of Aquitaine, the little French floozy, way back in the 13th century, who inherited a huge chunk, that huge western chunk of France called Aquitaine, and she married Henry II. And she was a very, very, very scratchy girl, according to historians. Didn't like England all that much, and liked Henry even less, but that was the way it was. And so she had three children, 3 boys in fact, one in the middle doesn't matter. The elder was called Richard, and he became known as Richard the Lionheart, and you've all heard of him, even Yola, who's such really... And he was born early in the marriage, as a matter of fact, at a time when Henry was still handsome, and Eleanor was still prepared to rub her long fingernails down his back instead of down his face, which he did in later years. But sometime later, John was born, and he was called John Blackland, as a matter of fact, because being the youngest son, he didn't inherit any land. And that had an effect on his life. So he was unexpected, unloved, and unexceptional at that time. They were going to call him Unwin, it's a good old Anglo-Saxon name. But of course they settled for John, because John was popular at that time. But the man, Darling Richard, Eleanor doted on Darling Richard, her eldest son, who was a tall, handsome lad. There he is. If you walk past the Houses of Parliament, you've probably been past it many, many times and seen there is the statue, the glorious statue of Richard the Lionheart. And there he is. He was about 6'3", give or take at that time, which was made of a giant in the 13th century. And he was handsome and virile, and Eleanor absolutely doted on him. And he is the man who was raised almost to sainthood, really, in this country, Richard the Lionheart. He did wonderful things for England. Oh, really? No, he didn't. I don't think so. But it just goes to show you what a posh name like Richard can do for you. Eleanor, in fact, was most concerned about Richard. She was most concerned to conceal the fact, apart from anything else, that he was gay, which would have been, unexceptional in modern society, but in those days it would have got him excommunicated, which wasn't a good route to kingship. And so she sent Richard to grow up in France. He grew up in France with King Louis, the young King Louis, tender King of France, who, as it happens, was also gay. And they got on very well together, as far as you know. Richard, in fact, at one stage wrote a letter home to his mother, a poem of his relationship, which said, we are like two chaffinches singing in a nest. So there you are. So I'm not entirely convinced that this portrayal of him was right, but he was some soldier and some guy. I mean, he wasn't an engineer and he wasn't a doctor, but he killed a few. So Richard, as soon as he became King of England, he emptied the treasury. Just emptied the treasury, tootled off on the Crusades. You all heard of the Crusades, of course. There were numerous Crusades, and the purpose of the Crusade was to rescue Jerusalem from the Muslims, who opened Jerusalem to everyone anyway. So it was just a lark. It was a bunch of Largalouts rolling around Europe, hacking off people's heads and just taking whatever loot they could find. But they called it the Crusades, and it went down well with the Pope. So when he ran out of money, Richard returned from the Crusades, and he took a detour through Europe, and he ended up in a castle with the German emperor at that time. Well, they were German emperors, because Germany had lots of different emperors, who took a dislike to him and threw him into slammer and demanded a huge ransom for his return to England. So, back in England, the entire nation was distraught at the fact that their favourite son, Richard the Lionheart, who had quite a reputation by that time, adorable Richard, was imprisoned in a dark dungeon in Germany. In fact, he and the lads were just having a good time getting the lager down their necks and waiting for the ransom to roll in, of which it is thought he might have been getting a cut, but never mind. So strolling minstrels roamed around England and sang songs of Richard's wondrous deeds and his cruel imprisonment, and women swooned in the streets, and the English peasants got together and they were told from the pulpit, because the Pope gave a message to all priests, they were told from the pulpit to cough up the money for Richard's ransom. And they coughed up a sum twice the annual national revenue, which is a fantastic sum in those days. I mean, I couldn't even begin to bring it into modern terms, it would be billions. And somehow the ransom was paid, all for darling Richard. And so they ransomed him and brought him home. I think if he'd been called John, they'd just have sent him a Dear John letter. Dear John, sorry to hear of your misfortune. Yes. Well, he was so grateful to England when he got back, so grateful that he emptied the treasury again, tootled off back to France, got into more battles, married an elderly lady who had plenty of money, and was killed when he was laying siege to a castle and fell off a ladder. So he was king for 10 years, but he spent most of it in France. 6 months he spent in England. He never did anything for the honest people of England, not a thing, bankrupted the country, but for some reason he is revered almost to sainthood as Richard. Richard the Lionheart, the man who was one of our greatest kings. So John became king, and I'd better press off. John became king, and the truth is, well, it didn't always look like that. He didn't do terribly well. He was badly advised by a load of hangers-on, quite frankly, that was his problem, with names like William Peach, Richard de Cleverly, and, unbelievably, one James Savile. I don't know if they called him Jimmy, but anyway, he certainly fixed it for John, because John couldn't handle the treasury. He just couldn't handle it. He increased taxes to try and get some money back. The country was bankrupt. Richard had gone, and there was literally no money left in the country. And his fatal mistake was he tried to make the aristocracy pay taxes. See, and that's what led to Magna Carta, that great, that famous thing where the great Declaration of Freedom, which just boils down to the fact that the King of England must not extract taxes from the common people, because that's the job of the aristocracy. That's their job to run them all blind. But there it is. So John had a hard time. John went to France again. He of course was king of all of Aquitaine and England at that time, and there was more money in Aquitaine, so he went to France. And it wasn't all bad. He married one of the great French beauties of the time, a girl called Isabella of Anjou, who was only 12 when they got married, but it was a little bit suspect, I suppose, but lives were shorter in those days, and she got on with it all right. She did what she was told, and they had a reasonably good time together. So I just wanted to contrast those two things, that John went down in history as a tyrant, ended up losing his life in that great expanse of water on East Anglia called the Wash, lost his jewels, died of dysentery. Not the cleverest of endings for a king or anyone else. But the thing is, I just wanted to say to you that he was a tyrant, and he was terrible, but he was no worse than the rest of them, and he deserves a better press. And if he'd had it, well, we might have had another King John. And then Richard, who did absolutely nothing for England, ended up a saint and with a statue in front of Westminster, just because he had a posh name, Richard. And the moral of the story is, get yourself a good publicist. I think it's time we had another King John, and I've written to the palace to say that I am available. I've not so far had a reply. When I do, I will let you know.